Well, so archetypes of the mature masculine, archetypes in general, this is not a kind of a topic that yields well to formulaic straight line ideas. It's more of a meander than it is a description or a definition. So let's take it in that vein and move a little slowly into the notion of the archetypes of the mature masculine. Let's begin with the notion of archetype itself. So many of these terms and words become familiar in the language and therefore cliched and therefore lose their significance and their potency and their depth. Archetype did have a history before Jung, although Jung was the psychologist who popularized the term, and now it's everywhere, of course. It's the original meaning or the classical meaning of archetype is an original mold or an original pattern. Just to expand it a little from my notes, the original pattern or model of which all things of the same type are representations or copies, a prototype. So that's a slim starting place. But let's have a look at the notion of archetype as described by Jung, and also the place that archetype has in our world, in our individual and collective world. So briefly, Jung's idea of the unconscious was more developed than Freud's. That is that Jung was happy to concede that the unconscious was a place of repressed sexual and aggressive and instinctual and primitive urges, as Freud had described. But Jung went further based on a dream that he had and his own researches, and said that in his view, there was a different and a deeper level or layer of the unconscious, which was not about your history or my personal history or their family history, but which was contingent upon us being human. And a somewhat oversimple analogy is that the human form, as long as we've known it, has a torso and a head, 2 arms and 2 legs. And Jung would say that the human psyche has a form, a form which is given to us as a legacy because we're part of the human species. And so that form is accessible and shared by us all. This is the notion of the collective unconscious. It's not about my repressed sexual urges. It's about my understanding and knowledge about what it means to die, what it means to be a student, what it means to be married, initiated, part of a harvest, to know the feminine, to know the beginnings as well as the ends. This knowledge is innate in us, says Jung, because we're human. It's the given, it's the legacy. So in theory, all of these experiences which are embedded in the unconscious are accessible. But the way in which information from the unconscious is accessible is usually by way of image, dream, audio information, and so on. So that while the archetype itself is difficult, if not impossible, to discern, what our method of contacting the archetypal energy is via image. An image I have in a spiritual revelation, an image I have in a nightmare, an image I have as part of my psychotic experience, an image I have as a result of ingesting plant medicine, an image I have in deep meditation. This is the kind of the translation, the transitional position between the archetypal energy and conscious life. So that, the Grim Reaper translates for many of us as some kind of an image which is to do with implacable death. This is an archetype. Likewise, running through a field of corn is an archetypal image of whatever, freedom, fullness, harvest, and so on. So there are many, many archetypes. Every traditional stage of life or human activity can be represented that way. So what we're speaking about here is a much broader definition than perhaps we're used to, where archetype is all about kings or shadows or animas and so on and so forth. That's true, but it's not completely true. So the first thing to do, I think, is to relax a little about knowing archetypes, learning them off by heart, knowing which archetype reflects which experience, and so on. And just allow ourselves to understand that there is a context for our behaviors, moods, thoughts, activities. And that context, of course, at one level, psychologically speaking, is our family of origin stuff. At another level, the context is about our human stuff. And both of those sets of circumstances or sets of energies inform us. So that on the surface, the conscious ego presumes it is fully empowered to act and to do things in a certain way and to achieve certain results, make certain relationships and so on, all true. But if we ignore the context, either of the drivenness of our unresolved wounds from family or the larger context of our human experience and our human development, then we are deluded. We do so at our peril. We are living on the surface rather than in the depths. So how do archetypes show up for us? Well, I mentioned a couple of examples before, and archetypes are enshrined in religious ritual, in great poetry, in iconography, and so on. But a couple of pieces of information, about the archetypal energies and experience, which I think are useful, are that firstly, archetypal energies which are unformed, powerful but unformed, and part of our experience, seek expression through the human psyche. Archetypal energies seek expression through the human psyche. I don't know why that is. That's the way it is. That's the way things are set up. That is, that these inchoate forces and ideas about, say, annihilation, darkness, seek expression in us and end up with images of serial killers or grim reapers or something else. So archetypes are pushing and pressuring for expression in this three-dimensional world. And secondly, which is also important when we're working with these things, they are really careless of the health of the individual human ego. I'll say that again. They are careless in their expression of the health of the individual human ego. So if we talk in electrical terms, an archetypal energy of 20,000 volts seeks expression through a 40-watt light bulb, and you can imagine what the results of that are. So I mention this as a kind of a heads up. That is, that when we are so blithely, as the current literature and current publicity tells us, contacting the archetypal experience, it's like putting your finger in a socket. And if you are well protected and your protection is a robust sense of yourself and not too many eclipses and damaged places, then that's tolerable. But there are times and circumstances and personalities in which this kind of contact is not tolerable, and which can be quite destructive of the individual sense of self. Now, that's not to frighten the horses. That's to try to establish some kind of parameters about what we're talking about here in terms of these forces. So Jung, from all of the archetypal kind of possibilities, Jung selected some particular archetypal constellations, concentrations, for describing the personal development of the individual. You've probably heard of these terms like persona, shadow, anima, animus. wise old man, great mother, self with a capital S. Those, those selections of archetypes are the ones that Jung used to describe and to articulate his notion of what maturation is about, maturation of the human psyche. And useful they are too. But Jung's selection is not the only selection. And in fact, what we are going to be talking about tonight is another selection, and that is from the link that you perhaps have looked at by Moore and Gillette. And it's called, just a second, I'll get it right, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, Rediscovering the Archetypes of the Mature Masculine. So here's a mythographer, a mythologist, and a Jungian psychologist collaborating to try to formulate, articulate, make visible constellations of attitudes, developmental stages, thoughts, feelings, activities, which are translatable into terms that we know. For example, king, warrior, lover, magician. Those four things. So this is a useful selection, but it's not the only one. Is the point. But it does go a long way to help us as men establish a map and perhaps establish a position on the map which we occupy, so that not only do we get a sense of the territory, but we may get a sense, hopefully get a sense of where we are in that territory without being lost. I suppose the basic breakdown of these four archetypes, of the king and the warrior and the lover and the magician, those four terms are, in the terms of the writers, the authors, terms to describe those archetypes in their fullness, in their full senior expression. That is, when the mold is full and is demonstrated. But in this particular way of looking at the archetypes, there are developmental phases before that fullness is achieved. And so let's just try to look at one of these archetypes. If the king archetype is an expression of seniority, autonomy, authority, mastery, sovereignty, then if we are not yet at that place in the development of that particular stream, then we are likely, say the authors, to be occupying a shadow perspective. That is a perspective which is less than positive and less than conscious, and we will be occupying one of two shadow perspectives. So if I'm not a king, then who am I? Well, I am one of two, perhaps, shadow, inferior, less conscious perspectives on the way through to maturation. So let's have a look at that one particular archetype in a bit more detail. If I'm not a king, if I'm a would-be king who hasn't found his way to kingship for whatever reason, and let's think about those reasons in a second, then according to this categorization, we perhaps are a tyrant or a weakling. So that the diagram is, in fact, or the diagram that is used by these fellas is a triangular diaphragm. At the apex sits the king, full, complete, and underneath at the other two angles are the shadow, not yet, shadow bipolar elements, which we've described, or they've described, as being a tyrant or a weakling. So let's see if we can put it in more human terms. Firstly, what enabled me to come to the fullness of this particular archetype? How is it that some people become kings and others don't? First thoughts would be an empowering environment, an environment in which the possibility of full development can occur. So obviously a social or a cultural or a national environment, but more early and more particularly a parental, a family environment, in particular, although not restricted to, the relationship between father and son. If a man has not achieved his own potential as a king, what is his capacity to pass that initiation on to his son? Debatable. Now, the accepted wisdom is you can't take someone anywhere where you haven't been yourself. I don't think that's strictly true. But in this particular case, if I am a frustrated king, a king who hasn't found his kingdom, someone who feels thwarted, then that will be the legacy that I will be passing on to my boy, my son. And that will probably be his highest attainment in his relationship with you as his father, unless and until he finds another parental figure to take this development further. So if I am thwarted in my kingship, then a tyrant or a weakling. So a tyrant, pretty clear, someone who is a cardboard cutout king. Someone who has the trappings and the language, perhaps the wealth, the status, the position of someone of power and sovereignty and mastery, but does not have the substance of this. And of course knows this. We know when we're faking it until we make it. And if we're faking it for a long time until we make it, our attempt to emulate kingship becomes harsh and strident, and we become tyrannical. Do it because I said so. Do it because I'm your boss. Don't ask me why, just do it. Whereas, a king in his sovereignty, in his fullness, would be more than happy to inform the boy or the worker or the servant of the big picture of these things, and to paint positively a place for the individual activity to occur, and to encourage and to educate and to evoke and to bring out, rather than to be tyrannical. So the other side of this shadow, if I am not yet in that place of kingship for whatever reason, is the sense of weakling. Now, weakling speaks for itself, kind of, that this is a person who has been defeated, has closed down the possibility of fulfillment in this dimension, has given up on completion, given up on maturation, has taken second best and has tried to make the best of that. But if my kingship is denied me, similar to being a warrior, if my sovereignty is denied me, then there's no point in seeking to express power. It just won't cut the mustard. It won't work. So my role, therefore, is to be unpowerful, is to be an unpowerful king, an unpowerful pretender. Now, we can, as men, and I hope that you'll, looking to your own experience as we talk, we can alternate between these two things, can we not? In certain arenas, I can be tyrannical with less powerful people, or given the cloak of my particular role as a policeman or whatever. I can be tyrannical, but also in other circumstances, when I'm in the presence of more powerful men or senior men, I have nothing to say. I have no initiative. I don't have any particular power. So if I'm caught in this immature position, or if I'm alternating between the two positions, then my life is one of restlessness. My life is one of a sense of incompletion, and increasingly a sense of bitterness or a sense of resignation. So I think this is a reasonable categorization, quite a good categorization, to give some clarity to who we are and who we could become. So if I am tyrannical, if I am by nature the sort of person who says, well, do it because I say so, then it's fairly easy to see what I am compensating for. I'm compensating for directly the opposite of that, the person who has no sovereignty, who hasn't achieved mastery, who hasn't achieved completion. So if I am wanting to stimulate my further development and to leave the kind of limited role that I'm in, the first requirement, of course, is attention and awareness. When I am shouting at my wife or shouting at my students or shouting at my animals, if I could stop for a split second, who would be talking? Who is that person? Who is that tyrant? Why is he shouting at such a pitch? If he didn't shout, what would he be doing? What would he be saying in the presence of this current situation, whatever it is, this current encounter? So by bringing awareness into the moment in which we are demonstrating these inferior perspectives, we have a chance of saying, well, really, I'm holding out against the tidal wave of insecurity that comes upon me every time I'm in the presence of men. So I have to be a certain way. I have to be demonstrating competency that I don't feel. So it's attention and awareness which helps. Now, as well as that categorization, I don't want to make it too complicated, but there is a further division that Moore and Gillette talk about, and that is the adolescent version of the archetype and the more senior version of the archetype. The adolescent version of the archetype is not about shadow. It is just simply about youth. It's a kind of a progressive step on the way. So in this particular description, again, the immature version, the adolescent version, the boy version of the king is the divine child. The divine child, interesting term. Hopefully you've heard of this before, also an archetype. The divine child is the clear channel of energy, blessed, uncontaminated, all powerful because connected to the powers of the cosmos, but completely powerless because the child is indeed a child and still needs support and protection. So the notion of the divine child is a glowing golden boy who is around whom creative things happen and greatnesses and miracles occur, but who himself is powerless to go to the fridge and make a sandwich because he's a child and needs protection. So what we have is a would-be king, an adolescent king, which we could call the divine child, working to maturity, the maturity of kingship, but subjected to shadow splintering and fragmentation if the process doesn't occur in a healthy way. So just to pause there for a minute, I'm always conscious of our timings here. Think back to your life. Think back to your relationship with your father. Think back to the interaction between him and you in this particular realm. Is he a man who is confident enough? Was he a man? Is he a man confident enough to initiate you into the world? To say to you, this is how the world showed up for me. This is how I entered the world, navigated the world, made sacrifices for the world, and took a reward from the world. This is the way it appears to me to have happened. I bequeath this knowledge to you. I'm passing my maturity and I'll be moving on to something else. Can you hear the sense of legacy, the sense of sincere legacy in that, as distinct from men who have nowhere near achieved that kind of contentment, but also are highly competitive of their boys, of their sons, of their children? Are you someone who's experienced a competitive father? I certainly was. And because because maturity wasn't achieved by him as fully as he would have liked, and he was passing on that discontent to me, and it showed up in terms of competitiveness. Now, look, that's only one part of the story of the relationship between my father and myself. I'm not saying that's all of it by a long shot. There are many positive aspects, but in that regard, I wasn't initiated into the potential of kingship. I was initiated into the potential of pretender. And so part of my work in this particular field has been simply to see the locks that have been placed on my sense of possibility and to release them so that at least I'm open to possibility, and then the developmental processes can resume. Now, does that strike a chord in people listening tonight? Just somewhat briefly, the other three archetypes are described as the lover, the magician, and the warrior. And so each of those two has a shadow aspect, and also has an immature aspect. Let me just take the idea of the warrior, because I find the immature aspect, the adolescent aspect, quite interesting, and I think it's relevant. The immature aspect of the warrior is described by Moore and Gillette as the hero. Now, at first glance, we think these terms are interchangeable, really. A warrior is a hero, heroes are good warriors, and so on and so forth. But let's break it down just a fraction. A warrior is a person who is very capable of participating in aggressive action for a cause, to save the kingdom, to save the family, to save the culture, to save the fortune. A hero has similar qualities of participation and aggression and initiative, but normally, or at least in this description, the hero is working for himself or herself. The warrior is working for the greater good, the collective. It's an interesting and useful distinction, because the world is full of heroes, have you noticed, in various domains, or indeed their shadow equivalents, but real warriors who are relaxed but dangerous. Jordan Peterson would say that someone who's in his own strength is dangerous. Not because he's a loose cannon, but because he has the potential. And I think a warrior, someone who's in the maturity of warriorship, could be seen as dangerous in that way. If there's something to be done, he can do it. A hero, on the other hand, is only dangerous when it's going to show up on Facebook. That is, he's not interested in the cause, he's interested in himself as the cause. And so that's, I think, is a useful distinction. The shadow aspects of those characters, and shadow aspects, of course, are part of these characters. So if you're occupying a shadow position, it doesn't mean it's all over. It means that you are occupying an as yet undeveloped part of this archetype. For example, the shadow of the warrior or the hero would needlessly have to be some kind of a bully. A warrior, who isn't a warrior, a hero who isn't a hero, would naturally adopt or be possessed by, which is a more accurate statement, a sense of bullying, and that can develop into sadism or psychopathy. That is, the person who really likes seeing others squirm because he can make them squirm, that person is occupying or is possessed by the shadow aspect of a genuine warrior or a genuine hero if he's younger. And the pairing of course of the bully or the sadist is the masochist and the weakling. That is, that someone who is not interested at all in ever showing up powerful in company, but who has great fantasies of power in his bedroom, in his reveries, when he's not having to engage with the world. So just to move on briefly to the other archetypes, the magician. The magician, if we translate that or into this life, 20th century three-dimensional life, is someone who has mastery of the instruments of the world, the tangible instruments of the world, someone who can do things, and someone who has acquired by experience, by inheritance, by skill, a kind of an invisible mastery, which enables him or her to enter the world easily and to create results in the world that other people find impossible. The undeveloped magician is described as the precocious child. That is the child that wants to know everything about the world always, from the earliest possible moment. You may be one of those, or you may know one of those people. And again, if we don't achieve that, if that is suppressed or repressed in some way, we're likely to be in our shadow representation, manifestation, we're likely to be a complete know-all or a dope, someone who allegedly knows nothing. So that's the polarity. Either I know everything and I'll tell you again and again, or I know nothing and don't rely on me for any information whatsoever. So the magician is the completion and the maturation of someone who interacts with the world as an equal, interacts with the world with confidence and lack of fear and effectiveness. The precocious child is one who wants to be like that and wants to acquire the knowledge that will enable him to be that way. The lover is the last of the archetypes. I can see people polishing their lapels as we talk about the lover, but the lover is not completely without difficulty. The immature aspect of the lover is called the Oedipal child. Eek. What's the Oedipal child in this particular description? The Oedipal child is one who hasn't yet freed himself from the influence of the mother, his mother. Hasn't individuated is the word, hasn't become independent from the arena, from the field of the feminine represented by his mother. And when this freedom is achieved, when this independence and individuation is achieved, the mature lover is someone who is in love with the world and is seen by the world as lovable. That is, where there is not a need-based or a power-based agenda in this person's operations in the world with any of his partners or any of her partners, lovers, children, wives, husbands, business partners. There's a sense of independence and passion, but the passion and the independence designate equality. You know, I love this person equally as he or she loves me. This one happens to be my wife. This one happens to be my student. This one happened, but the love is there uncontaminated. The person who hasn't achieved this kind of maturity is usually in some way impotent. That is, when I have to go through mum to get to my relationship with another human being, then it's not going to be empowering for me. If mum is standing, or dad, if we're working from the other direction, is standing between me and my potential lover, then I will be impotent in the classic sense of the term, maybe sexually dysfunctional, but impotent in terms of being able to take initiative, to be empowered, to put into the relationship something which will enable it to develop and to progress. And we find that we'd certainly see that in terms of dysfunction in the therapeutic room. What we don't see as much, because often enough in our society this function is celebrated, is the addicted lover. That is someone who wants to have sex with the world and wants to have sex with the world one person at a time, and spends so much energy, so much guile, so much initiative in sexual or romantic conquests, either ruthlessly or sentimentally. That is, that I ruthlessly want to get another notch on my gun so that I can, say that I've slept with 5,000 women this week, or I am in love with this person I accidentally bumped to on the escalator, and she's the only one for me. And when she doesn't reciprocate, I'm plunged into the abyss of despair, because I'm giving far too much away to someone who is not relationally relevant to what I'm giving away. So I become addicted by conquest, or addicted by sentimentality, or I become simply uninitiated, unempowered, impotent. These are the shadow aspects of the archetype. So it's been difficult to talk this way tonight because there's so much material, and I'm not going to give any more material. Look, please go to the book. My take on this is that these are useful descriptions and distinctions. I particularly like the developmental aspects, and it's important to if we're struggling with something, to see, could what I'm struggling with at the moment fit into any of these categories? Is this sense of dissatisfaction or difficulty relevant if I were to look at these archetypal notions? You see, the thing is that the archetypes possess us. Ideally, we have a relationship with archetypal experience. That is, I have a mature sense of self which has a relationship with the warrior archetype. And so, the warrior can show up when required and not show up when not required. But for most of us, because our sense of self is undeveloped, it is threadbare in places, it is fractured in places, we tend to be the victims of possession. Possession is a medieval word, but I like it. Something takes us over, and suddenly we're shouting, or suddenly we're compromised, or suddenly we're laying down the law to a 5-year-old. We're possessed. And what are we possessed by? We are possessed by the kind of the vehemence of the unresolved, immature archetype, seeking expression, but seeking expression in an immature way. So all of these times in which we lose our sense of self, and we wish to God we hadn't done that, or said that, or taken that job, those times when I don't know what came over me, this is the archetypal experience which we're not relating to, but we're simply the victim of. And the more knowledge we have about what the archetypal threads can be, the more we are capable of forming a relationship with these things, and therefore bringing some kind of contextual power into our lives. That is, it's not just me. My family history is clear, but I am in touch with powerful forces, and I am respectfully channeling them to achieve the world in some way. Without that, we are acting shallowly, and we're acting like people who are hypnotized and are the victims of whatever suggestion the puppeteer or the hypnotist is making. All right, that's all I want to say about that for the minute, folks. So I'll leave it there, Dave and Roger.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you for that. And we'll open up the chat room for questions. We've received quite a few already. But I thought I might sneak one in pretty early, personally. So with the king, warrior, lover, magician, are we saying that these energies are on an axis? So the king, warrior is an axis, and the lover, magician is another axis that inhabit us to a greater or lesser degree. So in a sense that the warrior is at service to your king, your kingness, your king energy. That warrior energy is at service to that king. Is that the suggestion?
It's a suggestion. I don't think it's as, the idea of axes is not, it's not quite that strong, but one can imagine that if we were going to sort of arrange these archetypes in a cluster, then the magician would have the idea, the king would have the resources, the warrior would have the executive power, and the lover would harmonize the result, something like that. I don't think it's not formally an axis. It's not quite an axis, but they do have interrelationships. And sometimes, can I be a warrior without instructions? Can I? Does that make me just a willy-nilly vagabond? So do I need a plan? Yes. And who develops the plan? Someone who has mastery of the operations of the world, the magician. So yes, there are connections and consequences, but I don't see the axis quite that strongly, Dave.
And I think just from my interpretation of that is, in terms of that warrior doing this, that the laser focus on an objective, the objective or the goal or the mission is part of that visionary stuff from the king.
Yes,
from that king, that kingness, if you like.
That's absolutely right. The king has the vision, and the warrior executes.
Right?
So that applies corporately, but also applies in terms of our own internal processes. For example, I might have 1,000 good ideas, but I never implement one of them because the king isn't talking to the warrior, or the warrior is undeveloped. The warrior resents the king for some reason or other. Because, power seems to be granted rather than having to be worked for, or what have you. So we can look at our operations at, starting from an idea and ending up with a harmonious execution. And if there are glitches in that internally or corporately or in terms of the organization, then we can use these ideas to see where the blockage might be and what needs to be done.
Okay, so we've got a set of questions, and Rog, I'll do the first one and you do the one after if you like, and we'll go from there. So we talked about shadows. One of the questions was, how do shadows develop?
A shadow develops when the sun shines on something, and that something obliterates the ground behind, so that the shadow is what is left out when the conscious personality or the conscious identity takes its place. So, in a neutral way, the shadow is not inherently bad or evil. It's simply that which is not brought into consciousness. And so, in a personal way, shadow is often said to develop out of the family of origin culture and the early education, secular and religious education. That's at a personal level. For example, in a righteous Christian family where there is no such thing as anger or resentment or criticism or negativity, then, and it's simply not allowed, well, it will naturally, because it's sanctioned, if I decide to say a few words to my sister and I get sanctioned for it, then soon enough I will learn that that's not on, and it will be, that particular quality will be repressed into the unconscious. This is really conditional learning. That is, certain behaviors, attitudes, characteristics are encouraged and certain others are sanctioned, and we learn as developing children what to bring to the surface and what not to bring to the surface. So you can see that this is impacted by time periods, culture, religion, family, education, all of those things, but mainly the family of origin. And yet, it's, an individual is not the only entity that can possess shadow. Families can possess shadow. Streams of culture can possess shadow. Nations can possess shadow. What was it that the Third Reich was trying to achieve in terms of human personality and physiology? Tall, blonde, blue-eyed, athletic, mastermen. What did Jews, how were Jews described by this Reich? Short, dark, swarthy, hunched. Can you hear that I can't afford to have any contamination in my perfect view of the master man. Anything that's dark, anything that's less than wonderful needs to be suppressed. And in this case, not only suppressed, but projected onto an entire race of people. And if I can eliminate them, then all will be perfect in a golden world. Can you see that? Can you see the horrendous thinking and the horrendous consequences of trying to project shadow out onto someone else or some other race and then eliminating it so that what's left is only the good? Doesn't work that way. Doesn't work in the yin yang symbol. Why would it work? Why would it work politically or socially? Of course we can strive for the good, but you know, what's the good? You know, my aggression has been suppressed out of me by sanctions and punishment might be very necessary if I'm trying to save my life or the life of my family. And if it's not there, it's been, you know, put into shadow, then I am left bereft. But if my aggression can be managed, it can be allowed up and can become assertiveness, the warrior's assertiveness and immovable assertiveness rather than the tyrant's aggression, then it's in the service of the being. It's in the service of the psyche. So shadow, often by simple education, personally, but also has a collective aspect, which comes from the depth of the unconscious and is really about expression of energy which can be destructive to the human being, the individual, or the group. It doesn't have to be, but is often that way. Normally, our shadow is embarrassing. You know, it's my meanness of spirit or my sexual lack of boundaries or my capacity to hoard or my just susceptibility to the mildest form of criticism. But it's not always like that. If I was born into a criminal family, a third generation criminal family, what would be in shadow with me would be cooperation with the authorities. Never talk to a cop, never give a sucker an even break. That's what's in consciousness if I happen to be in a criminal family. I'm just using this as an example, but those sort of things are shadows. So shadow's not always that which is universally acknowledged to be awful. It's just what happens out of the culture, at least in the personal form. That's it.
Thanks, Chris. What do you think, Rog?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, just a couple of things came through. Chris, you know, with psychometric stuff, you know, you tend to you can work people out eventually, you know, with like Myers-Briggs and you know, DISC and you know, things like Herman brain dominance and all that sort of stuff. I suppose you sort of connect with that and either corporately or maybe personally and stuff. But with archetypes, do you think you see, you know, if you go into a room and you're socialising and, you know, will the archetypes be sort of written on people's foreheads? You know what I mean? Is there a you know, is there a trigger that or are they just really, you have to sort of see it for about a year? Or, you know, is there triggers that can be noticed, you know, for, you know, he's a king, so I'm going to stay away from him because he's an arrogant son of a bitch, you know, that's, or whatever.
Yeah.
Is that a feeling you get, do you think?
Well, demeanor. Let's talk about demeanor. That is some kind of energetic, physico-muscular presentation. That is that, you know, if you were to look at a tyrant standing next to a weakling, then the distinctions would be there in the energetic field, in the way the body is held, the way the body moves. It's part of, you know, men's inner journey. Of course, we do that kind of thing to some significant degree, so that yes. We can observe and read different tendencies, which we could call archetypes, in the demeanor of the person. But I don't think it's you'd get the archetype fully. I think you'd need to listen to the person for some period of time, not a year, but, you know, just listen to the way people describe the world. You know, if my stories to you after a couple of drinks are about all of the women I've bedded, or all about the corporate coups I've had, and my description of my partners or the people, my adversaries, is very demeaning, you know, and very diminishing rather than the sense of a good encounter, then we can start to formulate ideas about a person's frustrated, tyrannical kingship or what have you. But I think it takes a little time, Roger. I don't think you'd pick it up directly from them saying nothing, but I don't think it takes forever.
And I suppose if people are lying, well, not lying, but if they're trying to pretend that they are something, then you'd probably pick it up as well, wouldn't it? It's probably the shadow side of someone coming out saying they've bedded 40 women, or, you know, women doing the reverse, or whatever the case may be. And I've done corporate rating, and I've got to the top, and I've bedded, you know, I've overtaken another CEO and stuff. I suppose you'd have a sense of authentic conversations, wouldn't you? You'd have to, you know, if it was pretty obviously a load of rubbish, then it probably indicates even another archetype popping out, doesn't it, I guess? Or a shadow.
Yeah, quite possibly. So, but, and, you know, if you've been around for a while, if you've done some work on yourself and you do encounter other human beings in your daily work, you know, people aren't fools. They'll put up with these kind of things, but there'll be a sense of deception, a sense of shallowness, a sense of pretense that most people will catch pretty quickly. I mean, it's quite useful to have that kind of knowledge if you're employing people, if you're wanting to, you know, get a team together or perform a task or achieve an outcome. You know, it'd be important that you know who's trying to be authentic and who's just spinning a yarn, you know. But in the therapeutic room, it shows up with people having painted themselves into a corner often. That is, you know, I just sold my business for $4 million and I feel totally miserable. You know, I've achieved every success that my father told me I should achieve, and I've got nothing. What the heck's going on? So that's normally how it shows up in the therapeutic endeavor. But, you know, in terms of your groups, your men's groups, for example, and the work that you're doing in a much bigger frame, it seems to me that it's it's imperative that men get to see their fault lines, you know, not just their fragility and limitation, which is realistic. Everyone should know what their limitations are. I don't have 6 legs, I've got 2, you know, so realistic limitations. But their fault lines, you know, when someone can walk up and press the button and they're gone, and what you've got is a raging 3-year-old in their place. You know, it's important that as the work that you're doing, that you actually allow men to appreciate their fault lines and to do some work with them so that they can enter into the maturity of these particular archetypes and make a difference. I think it's really important.
You think, just one other question, Dave, before I'll go back to you, but do you think, you know, if someone's talking about our men's group, you know, one of the things guys, you know, go into that and in some sense they're moving out of being shut down and moving out of being unconscious to one of consciousness and you know, authenticity, I suppose. But if a or male or female is shut down and unconscious, you know, whatever the tag we've got as an archetype, you know, if we've got that passed on archetype from our father or mother or whatever, do you think it would stay, you know, until you stop being shut down? You know, is that a fair call? In other words, if you realise that if you got it all together, you'll start to see these things and change who you are, you know, as in archetypal activity. Is that a fair call or fair question?
Attention and awareness is certainly the first port of call. You know, so armed with some knowledge, and looking to sort of pay attention to your own behavior and see whether it fits into those slots or those categories, that's a really good start. However, it seems to me that the developmental work by and large needs to be done in company. That is, in group, in one-on-one, in programs that have these intentions and these aims fairly clearly stated. It's very difficult to haul oneself up by one's own bootstraps without support and company. And the reason for that is that the archetypal experience is internal, but it is also very diluted. That is, that, you know, who's speaking now, Chris Caldwell or, you know, the hero? If the hero is speaking, I won't know. You know, if I'm not fully aware, Roger, I won't know the difference between, you know, the ordinary human Chris Caldwell who has particular connections and particular skills and limitations, and the bombastic hero who's sort of saying, give it to me, I can do it, I've had worse. And, you know, if we don't have that particularity of attention, it's just me. Well, it's not just me, it's me or the possessed me. And so that's the kind of work where I think having a supportive group where you have as your goal development and honesty, I think is really an accelerated process. On your own, wow, you know, it's a long journey because you don't have reference points. Unless someone can call you and say, that was good, that was really good, that's, you know, your voice tone changed, your eyes lit up, you sounded good, and that was crap, you know, because obviously, you know, someone else was talking. Without that kind of feedback loop, I think it's slow work. Yep.
Another question, Chris. I'll make it a two-parter. So one of the questions is, are you saying that the ideal masculine is embodiment of the king archetype solely?
Yes.
And the other part of the question is, do women have the same archetypes as men?
No, I'm not saying that, to answer the first question. That is that if by king, the associations that you have by king is someone who has filled the mold of himself, that is that, you know, he knows his kingdom, he's not, there's not unknown territory in terms of his personality or in terms of his reactivity or in terms of his intentionality. He knows these areas, he's in charge of that domain. Then that's kingship. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily top chief cook in a hierarchical structure. It simply means that in your own world you have mastery and you have sovereignty and you occupy the space. Now that world can be the world that is characterized by warriorship or by the personality and the achievement of the magician, or indeed the lover. So we're not talking about king being the boss and warrior, you know, even though we talked about the hierarchy of execution, that's quite different. No, the king is not the most desirable archetype unless you have as your idea of king someone who's master of the domain that he's been given. Jung used to talk about being whole, not being perfect, but being whole, W-H-O-L-E, whole. And, you know, he's right. That is what my entelechy, to use another word, E-N-T-E-L-E-C-H-Y, the entelechy of an acorn is an oak tree. You know, the final product of the blueprint, which looks like an acorn, is an oak tree. Every oak tree is different from the next one, but they are all of the genus oak. Likewise, you know, the fulfilled archetype is the oak tree. It doesn't mean that your tree, you know, your oak profile is the same as mine, but we do have a commonality. That is, we have reached the end of our possibilities. We've fulfilled our possibilities. Women having the same archetypes as men, those archetypes could be used. I think it's much more interesting, and it's not a men's work, women's work thing so much, but there are powerful women archetypes, particularly in the Greek pantheon, that I think would be more interesting and more accessible to women. For example, the distinction between, say, Athena who is a master strategist as an archetype, and Artemis, who's a wild girl, not interested in anything except the natural world and the natural processes. These are women goddesses, archetypes, who I think might be very useful for women to have a look at. But that's not to say that, no, you can't come into the boys' club of warriors and kings. Of course you can. But sometimes the access point is probably a bit more open with some of the goddesses, at least to start with, I think.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Chris.
thanks, Chris. I've got a couple of questions. I'll just, both of them very similar, so I'll ask them sort of together. In terms of, do we have to be strong in one archetype, and therefore the aim is to sort of try and be mature in all of them eventually, and can we have multiple archetypes in different aspects of our life? Is it one size fits all for me going forward, or the person who asked it?
We can relate that question to Jung's idea of what he called the 4 functions of a human being. Jung saw that there were 4 generalized functions of the human being: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. And they were either extroverted or introverted. This is another one of his categories. So in any individual, the functions, my level of intuition, sensation, feeling, thinking, are different. So that the patchwork or the completed painting, which is a mixture and a diffusion of all of those functions, is unique to you and different from what I have, although we're still using the same raw materials. We can say the same for the archetypes, it seems to me, and other models will bear that out. For instance, the astrological profile, which is a different model. If I have, astrologically 5 planets in Leo, then guess what? The king archetype is going to be a lot more accessible than the lover, for example. But if I have, 6 or 7 planets in water, in Pisces, where we, a planet of diffusion and devotion, or the sign, I mean, then more like the lover will be more accessible to me. That doesn't mean, though, that that different aspects of ourself which are undeveloped do show up for presentation during a long life, it seems to me. A midlife crisis, so-called, it's gone out of popular usage now, but a midlife crisis, one way of describing that, which I think is very reasonable, is that the undeveloped part of me, which I've been hiding because I can't do it properly and it's embarrassing, and my dad laughed at me when I tried to, and I'm hiding it, that comes up for development in the second half of life. And it's embarrassing because we're 13 years old trying to do a 50-year-old function. So it's a crisis. And so we avert the crisis by, staying young and running off with the secretary, or, becoming addicted and leaving it all behind, or whatever. So the crisis is often a response to these undeveloped archetypes or functions or gods or characters showing up. And that seems to be a natural process, Roger. That seems to be a process which Jung would say will happen to us. And he would call that part of the process of individuation. It's a kind of an unconscious pressure, unconscious developmental process, which we don't have power leverage with, but which happens anyway. And I think that's true. I think that what's relevant is at 30 is not relevant at 55, and that's not just an age thing. That's a different value system, a different attitude, a different sense of what's important showing up. It's just not the same as it was 6 years ago, and so on and so forth. So, different archetypes can show up for sure. But I think that we're given a profile, a photograph, an ID kit, which tends us to have more access and more ease with one archetype than the others.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Bye.
Okay, just maybe this might have to be the last one. Yeah, this is a bit of a challenging one, actually. Looking to the challenge of work in the interaction between the archetypes, both the full adult manifestation of of them and between the positive and negative shadows. So that's
it's a crowded room.
it's a crowded one, isn't it? Yeah, you're right. But I guess the way I'm interpreting that is, how do we engage these 4 archetypes in a effective way in our life?
Yes,
that's my interpretation of that.
Well, let's separate the 4 out into 4 individual archetypes and look in our behavior at what shadow material we're caught in each of those. So, if it's the warrior archetype, am I constantly being boastfully heroic, rather than genuinely sort of prepared to do battle for a cause? So by isolating one archetype and having a look at the limitations that we have, we can do some work on those, however we choose to work. And so it would be a matter of, certainly they would say this about Jung too, but if I'm sailing along, as I did yesterday, and ran into a very heavily policed schoolyard, which had me jumping through hoops until I couldn't take it anymore, and told them to stick it, well, not quite, and then got into all sorts of trouble as a result of it. And it's like, well, to hell with you, this is a mad system. But really, it would have been much more diplomatically sound if I'd actually buttoned my lip. And so something overtook me, and what overtook me was my sense of injustice, blah, 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 you know how it is, personal liberty, and so on, which in its place is true, but in this particular place was very undiplomatic. Something took me over. What took me over? Some shadow aspect of the warrior, that sort of said, well, you're not going to tell me what to do, rather than the warrior, which says, okay, well, yeah, I get it. I'll do this. And when I get out and get what I need, then I can reconsider. So in those cases where you're overtaken by something, then you have to do some work on that. Now, in terms of the interaction of the archetypes, if as Jung said, the central archetype is the self, capital S self, then the self should be able to allocate tasks according to what's going on in the external or internal world. That is, okay, challenge, need a warrior. Something incomprehensible, a mystery that really needs to be solved, a problem that needs to be analysed, let's get the magician in. So that the central organising archetype should be able to allocate tasks and call on resources, and the interactions would be via the coordinating self, I guess, rather than having the archetypes fight it out amongst themselves in the corner of the room or something. It's not quite like that.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Just one last quick one. What book would you recommend to get started with Jung's work? And there's lots of books around with Jung.
Yeah.
Is there a primer that you would recommend?
Yes, very. In fact, my mentor once upon a time, Peter O'Connor, Oconnor, Jung and the Search for Meaning. A lot of knowledge, really stepped down into digestible and understandable places. A lot of references, of course, you can expand out from there. But if you really want to start in a way that is, it's well informed but understandable, I think Jung and the Search for Meaning, Peter O'Connor, would be a good place to start.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Let's wind our session up. And again, thank you very much, Chris, for sharing your insight, your wisdom with everyone on the call tonight. And to everyone who's online tonight, thanks again for joining in. We really appreciate your support and for finding some time to connect with us and to just share in this really interesting conversation about topics that I think are valuable to as a community to explore. And I think what our intention would be going forward is to we've had 6 sessions with Chris in this last 6 months, just to explore that a bit further and into the next 6 months, and we'll come up with something and perhaps another set of topics, questions, themes that might be of benefit, and in the not too distant future we'll let you know what that might look like. So thanks again, folks. If you want to hang around and have a chat, feel free to do so, but for now, tonight's session is complete, and thanks, Chris Caldwell.
Yes,
great work again.
Thank you very much indeed. Much appreciated.